Namaste Vasudeva. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudire Naishtaprayeshu Avadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtike. So continuing with the discussion on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 23, the Song of the Avanti Brahma, text number 41 onwards. So Avanti Brahman is now he was suffering because he lost all his money and the people were not treating him properly. And as we saw how they were urinating on him, beating him up, doing all sorts of nonsense. And he was just tolerating everything. Paribhutimam gatham agayat naradham padyad biswa dharmastho dhritim asthaya sattvikim. Even while being insulted by these low-class men who were trying to effect his downfall, he remained steady in his spiritual duties. Fixing his resolution in the mode of goodness, he began to chant the following song. So resolution in the mode of goodness is described in Bhagavad Gita as, O son of Pritha, that determination which is unbreakable, which is sustained with steadfastness by yoga practice and thus controls the mind, life, and the acts of the senses is in the mode of goodness. So that in that mode or in that status of mind, he just carried on. Atheists who are envious of the devotees of the Supreme Lord are called Naradhams, or the lowest of men, and undoubtedly are en route to hell. By all means at their disposal, they disturb the devotional service of the Lord, sometimes by direct attack and sometimes by mockery. The devotees, however, remain tolerant, fixing their determination in the mode of goodness. As described by Srila Rupa Goswami in Updeshamrita, Vacho Vegam Manasa Krodha Vegam. A sober person who can tolerate the urge to speak, the mind's demands, the actions of anger, and the urges of the tongue, belly, and genitals, is qualified to make disciples all over the world. So he remained Avanti Brahman, he remained steadfast and determined in his duties, spiritual duties, and he tolerated all the insults. So now there is the song of the Avanti Brahman, the what he sang. Dvij uvacha, nayam jano me sukha dukha hetur, na devata atma greh karma kala, manah param karanam amananti, sansara chakram parivartayedyat. The Brahman said, these people are not the cause of my happiness and distress. Neither are the demigods, my own body, the planets, my past work or time, not even my karma or kal. Rather, it is a mind alone that causes happiness and distress and perpetuates the rotation of material life. So it's all the game of the mind, actually. Yes, we have to understand it's because of my karma that I'm getting the results of that. But mind, it's a mind. If it is in control, we can think like that. If it is not in control, we'll not think like that. And even if we think that it is my karma, it's coming before me, if mind is not in control, if intelligence is not spiritualized, we'll still try to take revenge or get distressed. It's very easy to get distressed, actually. And we do. This is what the symptom of Kali Yuga is. People are always fighting and people are always crying. Shudra means one who cries. And Kalo Shudra Sambhava. But we have to go beyond that. Mano gunan vesrajate baliyas tatascha karmani vilakshanani shuklani krishnanyat lohitani tebhya savarna srityo bhavanti The powerful mind actuates the functions of the material modes from which evolve the different kinds of material activities in the mode of goodness, ignorance, and passion. From the activities in each of these modes develop the corresponding statuses of life. In the mode of goodness, one considers himself to be a saintly or wise person. In the mode of passion, one struggles for material success. And in the mode of ignorance, one becomes cruel, lazy, and sinful. By the combination of the material modes, one identifies oneself as a demigod, a king, a rich capitalist, a wise scholar, etc. These conceptions are material designations generated from the modes of nature, and they arrange themselves according to the tendency of the powerful mind to enjoy temporary sense gratification. The word baliyas in this verse, meaning very strong, indicates that the material mind becomes insensitive to intelligent advice. Even if we are informed that we are committing many sins and offenses in order to earn money, we may still think that money should be acquired at all costs, since without it one cannot neither perform religious ceremonies nor gratify the senses with beautiful women, mansions, and vehicles. Once the money is achieved, one suffers further problems, but the stubborn mind will never heed good advice in this regard. One must therefore give up mental concoction and control the mind in Krishna consciousness, as exemplified here by the Brahman from Avanti. So mind, again, control of mind and the problems with the uncontrolled mind. Krishna also says in Bhagavad Gita, if mind is in your control, it's the best of the friends. And if it is not in control, it's the worst of the enemies. So the process of making progress in yoga or any yogic process, first thing is to control the mind. In bhakti process, we use the mind, engage the mind in Krishna service. So that's the best way to control the mind. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Anhi atma manasa samihata hiranyamayo matsak udvichaste manasvalingam parigriya kaman dushannibbado gunasangato aso. Although present along with the struggling mind within the material body, the super soul is not endeavoring because he is already endowed with transcendental enlightenment. Acting as my friend, he simply witnesses from his transcendental position. I, the infinitesimal spirit soul, on the other hand, have embraced this mind, which is a mirror reflecting the image of the material world. Thus, I have become engaged in enjoying objects of desire and am entangled due to contact with the modes of nature. So, although present along with struggling mind is the super soul, but the super soul is not doing anything. It's just witnessing how I struggle with this mind. Dhanam sadharmo niyamo yamascha shrutam cha karmani cha sadvritani sarve mano nigraha lakshanantaha paro hi yogo manasa samadhi. Charity, prescribed duties, observance of major and minor regulative principles, hearing from scriptures, pious works, and purifying vows all have their final aim in the subduing the mind. Indeed, concentration of the mind on the Supreme is the highest yoga. So that is the highest yoga. Even Krishna says, Man mana bhavo mad bhakto. Man mana, think of me. In your mind, put me in your mind, nothing else. But it's not that easy. Mind is so strong and flickering. Samahitam yasya manah prashantam danadibhi kim vad tasya krityam asanyatam yasya mano vinashyad danadibhishesh ched param kimebhi. If one's mind is perfectly fixed and pacified, then tell me what need does one have to perform ritualistic charity and other pious rituals? And if one's mind remains uncontrolled, lost in ignorance, then of what use are these engagements for him? So if mind is in control, you don't need to perform charity or other rituals, because one can then engage the mind in the service of Krishna easily, or think of Krishna. And if mind is not in control, then what's the use? Well, the use is slowly, mind will come in control. But here, this is the realizations of Avanti Brahman. Mano Vashyanya Bhavan Smadeva Manascha Nanyasya Vasham Sameti Bhishmo Hideva Sahasa Sahiyam Yunjayad Vashe Tam Sahideva Devaha. All the senses have been under the control of the mind since time immemorial, and the mind himself never comes under the sway of any other. He is stronger than the strongest, and his godlike power is fearsome. Therefore, anyone who can bring the mind under control becomes the master of all the senses. Wow. This is how powerful the mind is. If mind comes under the control, then he can become the master of all the senses. But the mind is stronger than the strongest, and its godlike power is fearsome. Tam durjayam shatrum asahya vedam arun tatum tudam tanna vijitya kechit kurvanti asad vigrahamatra martya mitrani udasina rituna vimudha. Failing to conquer this irrepressible enemy, the mind, whose urges are intolerable and who torments the heart, many people are completely bewildered and create useless quarrels with others. Thus they conclude that other people are either their friends, their enemies, or parties indifferent to them. So they themselves, they don't have control on their mind, and they think other people are their enemies or friends. Falsely identifying oneself as a material body and accepting bodily expansion, such as children and grandchildren, to be one's eternal property, one completely forgets that every living being is qualitatively one with God. There is no essential difference between one individual being and another, since all are external expansions of the Supreme Lord. The mind, absorbed in false ego, creates the material body, and by identification with the body, the conditioned soul is overwhelmed with false pride and ignorance, as described here. And once we are overwhelmed with this false pride, what do we think? This is my friend, this is my enemy, and these are my children, this is my family, and I have to take care of this family only. And this is for this lifetime. Next lifetime, somebody else will be my family, and I have another body, I have another false ego. And this goes on and on and on. Every lifetime, this goes on. Deham mano matram imam grihitva amaham iti andadhiyo manushya esho ahamanyo ayam iti brahmena durant pare tamasi brahmanti. Persons who identify with this body, which is simply the product of the material mind, are blinded in their intelligence, thinking in terms of I and mine. Because of the illusion of this is I, but that is someone else, they wander in endless darkness. And we all do that. This is I and mine. This is me. The body that I see, this is me. That's it. Janastu hetu sukh dukh yoshcheta kimat manaschatra hi bhaumyostat jivam kvachit sandashati svabhis tadvedanayam katamaya kupyet. If you say that these people are the cause of my happiness and distress, then where is the place of the soul in such a conception? This happiness and distress pertain not to the soul, but to the interactions of material bodies. If someone bites his tongue with his own teeth, at whom one can become angry in his suffering. Nice example. So many times we do bite our tongue with our teeth. So who's to be blamed? Although bodily pleasure and pain are felt by the soul, one must tolerate such duality, understanding it to be a creation of one's own material mind. If one accidentally bites his own tongue or lip, he cannot become angry and pull out his own teeth. Similarly, all living beings are individual parts and parcels of God and thus non-different from each other. All of them are meant to serve the Supreme Lord in spiritual equality. If the living beings give up their master's service and instead quarrel among themselves, they'll be forced to suffer by the laws of nature. If the conditioned souls establish artificial relationships of affection based on the material body and having nothing to do with God, then time itself will destroy such relationships and they will be subjected to further suffering. But if the individual living entities understand each other to be of the same family, all having connection with the Supreme Lord, their mutual friendship will develop. Thus, one should not exhibit anger that will be harmful to oneself and others. Although the Brahman was receiving kind offerings of charity from some people and being harassed and beaten by others, he denied that these people were the ultimate cause of his happiness and distress. For he was fixed on the platform of self-realization beyond the material body and mind. So this is how mind works. Very, very powerful. Dukhasya hetur yadi devatastu kimatmanastatra vikara yostat yadangamangena nihanyate kvachit krudhyet kasmai purusha swadehe. If you say that the demigods who rule the bodily senses cause suffering, still how can such suffering apply to the spirit soul? This acting and being acted upon are merely interactions of the changeable senses and their presiding deities. When one limb of the body attacks another, with whom can the person in that body be angry? So if we say that demigods is Adi Devik Klesh is the cause of suffering, well, then everybody has to suffer similarly, but not everybody suffers similarly. If Adi Atmik or Adi Bhautik Klesh we think is the cause of suffering, it's not. Then everybody has to suffer. But no, because everybody's mind is different and control of the mind is different, everybody suffers differently. Suffers or some people don't even suffer that. If somebody comes and abuses me in a way, then I'll suffer differently than the person standing next to me. So it's not that person is the cause of my suffering, it's my own mind. The Brahman is elaborately explaining the condition of self-realization in which one understands oneself to be totally distinct from the material body and mind and the demigods who control them. By cultivating bodily happiness, we are forced to accept bodily pain. Foolish, conditioned souls endeavor to eliminate distress and enjoy happiness. But material happiness and distress are two sides of the same coin. One cannot relish bodily happiness without identifying oneself as the body. But as soon as such identification occurs, one is harassed by the innumerable pains and sufferings also inevitably present within the same body. So if I am happy because of some favorable situations, then I'll be distressed if some unfavorable situations come in. The Krishna says, tolerate. Matra sparshastu konteya shitoshna dukshokha sattagama. So tolerate. Bodily happiness and distress are administered by the demigods who can never be brought under our control. Thus one remains subject to the whims of providence on the material platform. If, however, one surrenders to the personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna, the reservoir of all pleasure, one can reach the spiritual platform where transcendental bliss enlivens their liberated souls without any interrupting anxiety or unhappiness. So that is where we have to be. But we are stuck here because we think we are this body. So happiness and distress related to this body is mine. And that is when we cannot make progress spiritually. Atma yadi syat sukh dukh hetu kimanya tastatra nij swabhava nahi atmano anya yadi tan mrisha sriyat krudhet kasman na sukham na dukkham. If the soul himself were the cause of happiness and distress, then we could not blame others, since happiness and distress would simply be the nature of the soul. According to this theory, nothing except the soul actually exists, and if we were to perceive something besides the soul, that would be illusion. Therefore, since happiness and distress do not actually exist in this concept, why become angry at oneself or others? So now this Brahman is analyzing further. Because a dead body does not feel pleasure or pain, our happiness and distress are due to our own consciousness, which is the nature of the soul. It's not, however, the original function of the soul to enjoy material happiness and suffer material distress. These are produced by ignorant material affection and enmity based on false ego. Our involvement in sense gratification drags our consciousness into the material body, where it is shocked by the inevitable bodily pains and problems. On the spiritual platform, there is neither material happiness nor distress because the living consciousness is fully engaged, without personal desire, in the devotional service of the Supreme Lord. This is the actual position of happiness, aloof from false bodily identification. Rather than usually becoming enraged with others for one's own foolishness, one should take to self-realization and solve the problems of life. So as we said, that material solutions to material problems, they just bring about more problems. We have to try to transcend material problems. So on the spiritual platform, there is neither material happiness or material distress. There's only spiritual happiness. And even, in fact, the spiritual so-called distress also ultimately gives happiness. The real spiritual distress in the spiritual world is what? Basically being away from Krishna. That gives the most distress. But that distress, even while being away from Krishna, makes one think more of Krishna, more of the time spent with Krishna, more of the pastimes of Krishna, more of the service of Krishna. And that gives inner pleasure. And this, when one gets a chance to meet Krishna again, it just increases his pleasure. So in spiritual world, actually, there is no distress. Griha nimittam sukh dukhyos cheta kimat manvajasya janasya tevai grihara grihasyava vadanti pidam krudhyattas kasme purushas tato anya. And if we examine the hypothesis that the planets are the immediate causes of suffering and happiness, then also where is the relationship with the soul who is external? After all, the effect of the planets applies only to things that have taken birth. Expert astrologers have moreover explained how the planets are only causing pain to each other. Therefore, since a living entity is distinct from these planets and from the material body, against whom should he vent his anger? So, the effects of the planets applies only to things that have taken birth. Soul doesn't take birth, doesn't die. Na hanyate hanyamane sharire. So planets cannot affect the soul, but because we identify ourselves as a body, we get the sufferings. Now, Rahu planet is more strong, or Shani planet is bothering me, or Mangal is bothering me. Actually, it's our mind that is bothering us. Karmastu hetu sukha dukhayoshcheta kimatma manastadhi jada jadatve dehastva chit purusho ayam suparana krudhyatasmai nahi karma moolam. If we assume that fruitive work is a cause of happiness and distress, we are still not dealing with the soul. The idea of material work arises when there is a spiritual actor who's conscious and a material body that undergoes the transformation of happiness and distress as a reaction to such work. Since the body has no life, it cannot be the actual recipient of happiness and distress. Nor can the soul, who is ultimately completely spiritual and aloof from the material body. Since karma thus has no ultimate basis in either the body or the soul, at whom can one become angry? Of course, these realizations cannot be of an ordinary person. It can only be of somebody who is spiritually very advanced. Since the body has no life, so body cannot be happy or distress or in distress. Mind also cannot, it's all material. It's the soul only experiences happiness and distress. But the soul is spiritual. It should not experience any material happiness or distress. But because we identify with the body, we undergo this happiness and distress related to the body. The material body is composed of earth, water, fire, and air, just like bricks, stones, and other objects. Our consciousness, falsely absorbed in the body, experiences happiness and distress, and fruitive work is performed when we falsely consider ourselves to be the enjoyers of this material world. False ego is thus the illusory combination within our minds of the self and the body, which are actually two separate objects. Since karma or material work is based on illusory consciousness, these activities are also illusory and have no factual basis in either the body or the soul. When a conditioned soul falsely considers himself to be the body, and consequently the enjoyer of the material world, he tries to find pleasure in illicit connection with women. Such sinful activities based on his false concept of being the body and thus the enjoyer of women and of the world. Since he is not the body, his activity of enjoying of women does not actually exist. There is merely the interaction of two machines, namely the two bodies, and the interaction of the illusory consciousness of the man and woman. The sensation of illicit sex occurs within the material body and is falsely assimilated by the false ego as its own experience. Thus, the miserable or pleasurable reactions of karma ultimately act upon the false ego and not upon the body, which is composed of dull matter, not upon the soul, which has nothing to do with the matter. So it's a false consciousness or illusory or material consciousness. That is where the reactions happen. False ego is the illusory concoction of the mind. It is specifically this false ego that is suffering happiness and distress. The soul cannot become angry at others since he is not personally enjoying or suffering. Rather, the false ego is doing this. Difficult to understand, but because we all are conditioned souls, we are in so much of ignorance, we cannot think of. Now, here the example of sexual activity is given. So in that, Just two machines are interacting. Where is the question of happiness? It's just like if I take a screwdriver and a screw. So where is the question of any happiness between the screwdriver and the screw, or the wrench and the nut bolt? But when if there is a, suppose there is soul in the wrench and the soul in the nut bolt, they identify themselves as a wrench and the nut bolt, and when the wrench is tightening the nut and bolt, and then they feel pleasure out of that interaction, then it's nonsense actually. If we think of this, then it's nonsense. What are you thinking? Why are you thinking like that? But this is what we go through. And false ego is an illusory concoction of the mind. It is specifically this false ego that is suffering happiness and stress. If I think I'm the man and the other person is a woman, and just interaction, and the interaction is what? As Prahlad Maharaj said, it's just rubbing of two pieces of skin. Where is the happiness? So we think this is in material world, this is the highest form of pleasure. Not happiness, the pleasure. Kalastu hetu sukha dukhayosh cheta kimatmanas tatra tadatma kosam nagner hi tapo nimasya tatsyat krudhyat kasmai na parasya dvandvam. If we accept time as the cause of happiness and distress, that experience still cannot apply to the spirit soul, since time is a manifestation of the Lord's spiritual potency, and living entities are also expansions of the Lord's spiritual potency, manifesting through time. Certainly, a fire does not burn its own flames of sparks, nor does a cold harm its own snowflakes or hail. In fact, the spirit soul is transcendental and beyond the experience of material happiness and distress. At whom, therefore, should one become angry? So the material body is dull matter and does not experience happiness, distress, or anything else, because the spirit soul is completely transcendental. It should fix his consciousness on the transcendental Lord, who is beyond material happiness and distress. It's only when transcendental consciousness falsely identifies with dull matter that the living entity imagines he is enjoying and suffering in the material world. This illusory identification of consciousness with matter is called false ego and is a cause of material existence. And this false ego, when we have to replace it with real ego. I am servant of, I am a spirit soul and I am servant of Krishna. Na kenachit kvapi kathanchanasya dvandvoparaga parata parasya yatamaha samsriti rupina syan evam prabuddho na bibheti bhutah. The false ego gives shape to illusory material existence and thus experiences material happiness and distress. The spirit soul, however, is transcendental to material nature. He can never actually be affected by material happiness and distress in any place, under any circumstance, or by the agency of any person. A person who understands this has nothing whatsoever to fear from the material creation. The Brahman has refuted 6 specific explanations of the happiness and distress of the living entity, and now he refuses any other explanation that might be given. On the basis of false ego, the bodily covering factually overwhelms the spirit soul, and thus one falsely enjoys and suffers that which has no real relationship with oneself. One who can understand this sublime teaching of the Brahman spoken by the Lord to Uddhava will never again suffer the terrible anxiety of fear within the material world. So this fear in the material world is because we think we are this body, or the suffering or the happiness because I think I'm this body. Etam sasthaya paratma nishtam adhyasitam purvatamer maharshibi aham tarishyami durantaparam tamam mukundangri nishevayeva. I shall cross over the insurmountable ocean of nations by being firmly fixed in the service of the lotus feet of Krishna. This was approved by the previous acharyas who were fixed in firm devotion to the Lord, Paramatma, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So he's saying this is approved by previous acharyas. Means he's saying, I'm not following my own path. Oh, I'm not making up my own path. It's all coming in the Guru Parampara. This verse is quoted by Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Prabhupada says, in connection with this verse, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says that of the 64 items required for rendering devotional service, so these 64 items are mentioned in Nectar of Devotion. Acceptance of the symbolic marks of sannyas is a regulative principle. If one accepts a sannyas order, his main business is to devote his life completely to the service of Mukunda, Krishna. If one does not completely devote his mind and body to the service of the Lord, he does not actually become a sannyasi. It's not simply a matter of changing dress. In Bhagavad Gita, it is also said, Nashita karma phalam karyam karma karoti sa sannyasi cha yogi cha. So one who works devotedly for the satisfaction of Krishna is a sannyasi. The dress is not sannyas, but the attitude of service to Krishna is. So sannyas doesn't mean just changing the dress from white or whatever to saffron. The word Paratma Nishtha means being a devotee of Lord Krishna. Paratma, the Supreme Person, is Krishna. Those who are completely dedicated to the lotus feet of Krishna in service are actually sannyasis. As a matter of formality, the devotee accepts the sannyas dress as previous acharyas did. He also accepted 3 dandas. So later Vishnu Swami considered that accepting the dress of the 3 dandi was Paratma Nishtha. Therefore, sincere devotees add another danda, the Jiva danda, to the 3 existing dandas. So as we know, 3 dandi, 3 dandas are there that represent body, words, and mind. And above it, there is a moon shape, crescent moon shape, like a sea. So that represents the soul. That is also for Vaishnava sannyasi. This is the soul is also rendering service, or always engaged in the service of Krishna. So again, the purport goes on between Mayavadi, Ekdandi sannyasi, and 3 dandi sannyasis in Vaishnava orders. So further on, it's a long purport. So further on, in the last paragraph, again, it quotes this verse from Updeshamrita, Nectar of Instruction. One who can control the forces of speech, mind, anger, belly, tongue, and genitals is known as a Goswami and is competent to accept disciples all over the world. The followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu never accepted the Mayavad order of sannyas, and for this they cannot be blamed. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu accepted Sridhar Swami who was a Tridandi sannyasi, but the Mayavadi sannyasis not understanding Sridhar Swami. That is, when we discuss Chaitanya Charitamrita, we can discuss all this. Text 58. Shri Bhagwan Vacha Nirvidya Nashta Dravine Gat Klama Pravrajya Dam Paritamana Itam Nirakrito Asadnirapi Sadharmada Akampito Amo Munira Dar. Lord Krishna said, thus becoming detached upon the loss of his property, this sage gave up his moroseness. He left home taking sannyas and began to travel about the earth. Even when insulted by foolish rascals, he remained unswerved from his duty and chanted this song. So this song he himself made out of his realizations, but he was completely happy when he was chanting this song, and he tolerated all the insults and carried on with the spiritual duties. So thus becoming free from the materialistic way of life, which involves grueling austerities performed to acquire money, image, and the preceding songs of the Vaishnava sannyasi. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur states that if one is not capable of listening to the song of this sannyasi, one will certainly remain an obedient servant of material illusion. So such an important song or the verses mentioned by Avanti Brahman that found place in Srimad Bhagavatam, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says, one will fall down. One will certainly remain an obedient servant of material illusion if one then not listening or chanting this song. Sukh dukh prado nanya purushasya atma vibhramaha mitro dasina varipiravava sansaras tamasah kritaha. No other force besides his own mental confusion makes a soul experience happiness and distress. His perception of friends, neutral parties and enemies and the whole material life he builds around this perception are simply created out of ignorance. Everyone is working hard to please their friends, defeat their enemies, and maintain the status quo with net neutral parties. These relations are certainly based on the material body and do not exist beyond the body's inevitable demise. They're called ignorance or material illusion. And once the body is gone, all these enmities are well. In a way, they are gone, but they are struck as sanskaras in the consciousness. And so next life, or maybe many lifetimes later, if you meet that person again, although that person has taken up another body, but the relation, the karmic entanglement is still there. So it might just come up again. Any act of friendship or enmity. Tasmat sarvat mana tata nigrihana manodhya maya veshitya yukta eta van yoga sangraha. My dear Uddhav, fixing your intelligence on me, you should thus completely control the mind. This is the essence of the science of yoga. Ye tam bhikshuna gitam brahmanishtam samahita dharyan chravyan charanam dvandvar neva vibhuyate. Anyone who listens to or recites to others this song of the sannyasi, which presents scientific knowledge of the absolute, and who thus meditates upon it with full attention, will never again be overwhelmed by the dualities of material happiness and distress. Haribol, this is a Shrutifal here. Krishna is saying. So all we have to do, listen to or recite to others this song of sannyasi, means with faith. And then we can get out of this bodily concept of life. The Vaishnava sannyasi took shelter of the devotional service of the Lord and thus would overcome the illusory potency of his worshipable object, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He himself meditated upon and heard this song and thus also taught it to others. Having received the Lord's mercy, then he enlightened other conditioned souls with transcendental intelligence so that they could also follow in the footsteps of the devotees of the Lord. Religion actually means to become a pure devotee of the Supreme Lord in loving service. Those who are trying to enjoy the material world or merely renounce it to avoid personal inconvenience cannot actually understand love of Godhead, in which the only objective is the satisfaction of the Lord. So thus ends the purpose to 11th canto, 23rd chapter of Bhagavatam, entitled The Song of the Avanti Brahman. So we'll stop here. Tomorrow we'll start the next chapter. See anybody has any questions or comments?
हरे कृष्ण प्रभु जी।
हरे कृष्ण।
प्रभु जी, जड़ भारत का भी जब हमने चैप्टर पढ़े थे तो भी सिमिलैरिटीज थी नाउन में भी, मतलब यही सब कुछ है ना। इट वाज
यही तो भागवतम सिखा रहा है, पर हम लोग नहीं सीखते।
I know.
हम लोग नहीं सीखते हैं. But anyway, slowly.
Yes.
ठीक है. Okay, Mata. So you all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jai Shri Ram.